Today's hearing, again, is focusing on global warming science, its implications. The evidence has been overwhelming that global warming poses a serious threat to the American people and that we must act now to prevent devastating consequences. In dozens of hearings and briefings in this committee, in this room, we heard presentations from Nobel Prize-winning scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. We've heard repeatedly that global warming endangers public health and welfare. We heard that from the Bush administration's own CDC. The IPCC found that global warming is unequivocal and that most of the recent warming is due to human activities. In North America, the IPCC warned of risks to the public health, including increased frequency and duration of heat waves and heat-related illness and death, increased waterborne disease from degraded water quality, and increased respiratory disease, including asthma and other lung diseases from increased smog. Children and the elderly will be especially vulnerable to these impacts. It was interesting, the recent document we received from the EPA basically said all that right out there and showed the enormous impact global warming will have all across our country. In the U.S., there'll be reduced snowpack in the western mountains, critically reducing access to water. There'll be prolonged droughts and insect invasions that will kill crops and damage forests, leaving them more susceptible to fire. And I want to say to my colleagues, we're having a taste in California of fires that are caused by what they call dry lightning. And at one point, we had more than 1,000 fires burning. Coastal communities and habitats will be battered by intensified storms. And leading scientists every week sound new warnings. Let's look at a few headlines over the last several weeks. Warming west is ground zero for wildfires. Wetlands could unleash carbon bomb. Climate change may muddy better than bottled New York tap water. Global warming to deplete Great Lakes even more. Is there more? Do you have a second chart? We're fortunate to be joined today by an IPCC scientist who will share some of the latest information with us on the dangers posed by global warming. I'd also like to place in the record a statement from Dr. Pachauri, chairman of the IPCC, whom I've met with and who graciously briefed colleagues on both sides of the aisle months ago. But despite the scientific consensus, despite the danger, the Bush administration has failed to take any meaningful action. In fact, rather than addressing the problem, recent investigations by the press and congressional committees have documented an effort by the White House and the Office of the VP to cover up the threat posed by global warming. We know they've censored documents, including CDC testimony. They've muzzled scientists. They've ignored unanimous recommendations from agency experts to act. The Bush administration's lack of action threatens the health and welfare of the American people, but it is true that their lack of action benefits a narrow group of special interests. Nevertheless, we know we have the tools to begin to act now. The Supreme Court case, Massachusetts v. EPA, decided last April, made it absolutely clear that our Clean Air Act applies to global warming emissions. Unfortunately, the Bush administration has defied Supreme Court ruling and they've pushed off action. In our hearing today, we'll hear more about how that happened. Not only has the Bush administration itself failed to act, but they're blocking the action of states like California and as many as 19 other states that are waiting to follow suit. To me, it's one thing to say, I'm in charge and we're not doing one thing about global warming, despite the law, despite everything else. It's another thing to stop the states who want to play a role in solving this problem. So I'm committed to continue to press for action at the earliest opportunity. We won't let up in this committee. We can't afford to. We have the opportunity to solve the problem. It lies in the Clean Air Act. It lies in legislation we should be able to agree to across party labels. And we're going to solve the problem. It's a question of when, and it's going to be soon. And I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today. And with that, I'll call on Senator Bond.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing today on regulating carbon dioxide. I'm sure we'll be treated to many breathless statements, questions, and answers about who said what and when regarding EPA's plans to regulate carbon dioxide. But while that's going on, I hope those who may be listening and those who are here will remember these remarks about what really is going on here. You might have thought that I would launch into a statement of condemnation about the naked political goals of this hearing. That certainly is the case, but something even more important is at stake with this issue. It threatens every family, every worker, every farmer, and every driver in this nation. Each of these groups are already suffering. Families are struggling with record high gas prices. This summer will bring high power bills to pay for air conditioning. We're hearing that families will pay high heating bills this winter. Workers are suffering as their good-paying manufacturing jobs are going overseas to countries with cheaper energy. Huge segments of the American economy are shutting down and going abroad. Fertilizers, plastics, and chemical operations are all fleeing America's high prices for places like Asia and the Middle East. I might add that they're going to countries with weaker environmental laws that will pollute more and certainly not control for carbon dioxide or energy efficiency. And I would share the goal that the chair is, that we are going to reduce carbon. We are going to promote energy efficiency. We have a wide range of actions that we need to take to get things done in a responsible manner. But what is the real threat to the people of America? That threat is even higher energy prices and more lost jobs. On top of record gas prices, even higher prices for gas. On top of higher power bills, even higher prices for power. On top of lost manufacturing jobs, even more jobs lost. Just last month, advocates attempted to push through Congress a plan to oppose a $6.7 trillion, that's trillion with a T, $6.7 trillion in high energy costs. Those energy costs resulting from a price on carbon would be passed on to American families and workers. Additionally, that carbon cap bill would have increased gas prices by $1.40 per gallon. That would be on top of our record high prices. My constituents are already fed up with $4 gasoline. There's no way I can convince them to pay $5.50 or more a gallon for gasoline. There's no way that they should. Some have said it just went up too quickly. Well, I disagree. It just went up too high. But that would be the unavoidable result of impossible carbon reduction targets set to levels and on timelines that technology cannot meet. Without provisions to control costs as well as carbon, the American people will face sky-high energy costs and lost jobs. Now we have the advocates back. They could not impose their plans through the Senate floor. Today we will examine why they could not impose their plans through federal regulation. The tools may be different. Existing legislation instead of new legislation, command and control regulation instead of cap and trade. But no doubt the results would be the same. Pain and suffering for the American people, already suffering the pain of high energy prices. And for those under new Clean Air Act carbon regulations, it would be a complete disaster. The Clean Air Act was never intended to regulate carbon dioxide. Congressman John Dingell wrote the Clean Air Act. He says he never intended it to cover carbon dioxide. It was a law rightfully intended to reduce pollution from major sources such as power plants, refineries, and chemical plants. And I was a co-sponsor of the Bond-Bird acid training compromise that helped pass the Clean Air Act. But now, this law is being applied to suck in tens of thousands of small businesses, farms, commercial buildings, hospitals, and schools. They would be forced to spend tens of thousands of dollars each to submit cumbersome and complicated air permits to the states and EPA. And that regulatory nightmare would be accompanied by a litigation nightmare, as dozens of questionable legal issues will be litigated in the courts. Now, that may be the agenda of some, but it's not my agenda. It's not the agenda of the people of Missouri. I am very glad that the administrator had the good adult judgment and the courage to stop, take a breath, and ask what the world we're getting ourselves into We saw the Senate want to know part of what we'd get into. I'm confident the American people feel the same.
Thank you, Senator. This hearing is not refighting the global warming bill, the Boxer, Lieberman, Warner, but since you brought it up, I want to make a point because you misspoke on it. I'm sure you believe what you said, but the fact is the vast majority of the funds coming in, which would come from a cap-and-trade system, goes directly to consumers, okay, to make sure that they are helped during the energy transition. Then once we get the alternatives, which a lot of other funds are used for, to develop those alternatives, prices will actually go down. So there's a large chunk of that $6 trillion that goes to researching alternative energies and encouraging those. A lot of funds go to the states for that. And then the last tranche of big dollars goes to deficit reduction. My friend may have noticed that we have a real deficit problem. So that's what our bill did. And 54 senators expressed themselves, 48 on the floor of the Senate, 6 with letters to us saying they were for moving this bill forward. But today we're looking at the science. The other point I want to make about gas prices is I so agree with my friend on this. And that's why our leader is bringing to the floor an anti-speculation bill, because experts have told us that some people think it's as high as 45% of the price for a barrel of oil has to do with people speculating in the futures market. And I really look forward to taking that bill up. And if our friends want to offer an amendment on drilling in the moratoria, pristine coastal areas, we have a solution to that. We say to the oil companies, you've got 68 million acres, use it or lose it. You've got another 28 million acres available in the Alaska Naval Reserve. Go for it. We believe we need a policy that is not driven by the oil companies, but are driven by what is right. And my friend says that Mr. Johnson had the courage to say, let's take the deep breath. He's been taking a deep breath for many years now on global warming. We are the last person at the party to understand this is an issue. Whether you look at our allies around the world or you look at our states that are doing so much already. So, yes, sir. Yes, you may.
Well, I thank the chair. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to continue this discussion. I would note that under the Warner-Lieberman bill, $6.7 trillion would be taken away from workers in America. Only $900 million would come back in tax relief. I would point out that the speculation driving up the price is not just speculators on Wall Street. I saw last week that CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, had invested billions of dollars in the high future cost of energy. The reason they bet on energy going up, as long as we keep all of the land that potentially has oil and gas out of production, and 97% of offshore, 94% of federal lands are out of production, then that gas price will go up. So we will look forward to discussing with you further.
Yeah, and I totally let the record show those numbers make no sense at all to me. So we will get in the record our response to Senator Bond. And his misstatement of what our bill says, taking money away from America's workers. I mean, that is really extraordinary. So we're going to go forward now, and we're going to turn to Senator Lautenberg.
Going in order, Senator Cardin. Please. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chairman, for the leadership on so many issues that we face here, and your unwillingness to let casual dismissal of reality take place. I compliment you for that. When we look at the world out in front of us, and I've got to tell you that while high prices for gas and resultant services, heat and light, and is drowning our society, to use the expression, the fact is that ahead of that concern is whether or not our children are able to grow up healthfully. That, to me, is the principal mission that we have here. Yes, we have to keep it in some kind of financial order? Absolutely. My heart breaks for those who are dependent on gasoline for commuting or for getting kids to school or mom to the doctor and so forth. It's awful, and we ought to take care of that. Energy has got to be more available from renewable sources. But if the first thing we start with is costs that are developed with a skew to them, that we become dissuaded from doing the best we can for the health of our families, then we're on terribly different wavelengths here. Floods have turned some of Iowa's fields and roads into rivers. Fire has turned California's mountains to black ash, and heat waves have killed tens of thousands of people in Europe. These disasters will only become more common as we feel the effects of global warming. And as a result of global warming, drastic changes in our climate and the dramatic events that they cause are on the rise. Several weeks ago, EPA scientists mapped out the consequences of the threat posed by global warming. And I point to it. It's a fairly concise, I think very dramatic presentation of what the effects are of global warming distributed regionally. And I note with interest that even a place like Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, will have degraded air quality, urban heat islands, wildfires, and it goes on. Heat waves, drought, tropical storms, extra rainfall with flooding, and wherever they have water boundaries, sea levels rising. The chart spells out very clearly the increased risk to each region of our country as a result of global warming. This is done by scientists at EPA. We're not talking about minor shifts in the weather. We're talking about heat waves. We're talking about drought, fire, and flooding, major threats to our country and our world. Even with more storms and the possibility of more destruction, some of our colleagues are still arguing that global warming is a farce. And even among those who agreed that global warming is a fact, some argue, and we've heard it, that taking action is too expensive. These arguments are not acceptable in my family, and as a consequence, it's not acceptable in any family. When we have bad air days, whatever the cause may be, my grandson is watched so carefully by my daughter. He's 14 years old. And when he starts to wheeze, her knees start to shake. And it happens more frequently all the time. And I want everybody's grandchildren to be free of that kind of threat. These arguments are not acceptable. Fighting global warming is not a choice, it's a necessity. It's the single greatest environmental threat to our planet. And our children cannot afford a failure for us to act promptly, boldly, and decisively. Yet the Bush administration has had 8 years to show the kind of leadership that takes that kind of action. And for 8 years, they've sat on their hands. The administration denied 15 states, including my state of New Jersey, the right to cut greenhouse gases, wanted to preempt our rules and regulations. The right to cut greenhouse gas emissions from cars, trucks, and buses. Last year, the Supreme Court ruled the EPA must consider regulating greenhouse gas emissions to fight global warming. EPA was moving in the right direction to start the process of regulating these gases. But ExxonMobil and other big oil companies pushed back, and instead of siding with our children, the Bush administration chose to side with big oil, decided not to fight global warming. Madam Chairman, I appreciate the fact that I've run over, as seems to be. Okay, I'm wrapping up. I commend you for your leadership on this issue so critical when we have a White House that undermines our efforts at every turn. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm much more generous, but we do have a vote in an hour. So Senator Craig, if everyone could stick to the 5 minutes and preferably 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Frank has used my 5. I'll yield. Thank you.
All right. Senator Cardin.
I'll send you a note.
That was
Madam Chair, first, let me just comment very briefly on the exchange between you and Senator Bond. There's a lot of frustration, not only among the members of the United States Senate, but among the people of this country. And it's because of the failure of our country to have an energy policy. We haven't had an energy policy, and we've seen during this term of Congress the consequences. We saw that in the fact that we are not secure. We need to commit our military internationally because of the need for imported oil. We've seen that in regards to the large increase in the cost of energy, not only with the use of our automobiles and gasoline, but the utility bills in our homes have caused extreme hardship, the large increase in cost. And we see it in our environment. And I thank you for having this hearing, because I think that we have a common answer to all three of the problems. And that is legislation that will get us off of oil and develop alternative fuels that are going to be friendly towards our environment and dealing with conservation in a way that we use energy more efficiently. All that will help us solve all three of the consequences of our current failure to have an energy policy. So I thank you for holding this hearing so we can take a look at the continued evidence of the impact of global climate change. To me, it has been clear that it's affected not just our environment, and Madam Chair, you know of my interest in the ecosystems such as the Chesapeake Bay and the impact that global climate change is having on that national resource. On our human welfare, we see that with the rising sea level effect it's having on those who live near our waters, but also the impact of extreme weather, the impact on agriculture, and I could go on and on and on. That's why I particularly appreciate this hearing, because we will be getting an update on the good scientific information, which I think we need to base our decisions on good science, on what will make sense. And yes, the Lieberman-Warner bill, which I'm a proud co-sponsor of, and believe it's an extremely important bill to get done, will allow us to take the necessary steps to deal with the consequences of global climate change and be an international leader. But we want to make sure we have the good science information, the good technical information. And one of the things that I've urged, Madam Chair, that as we go through this process, let's make sure we have a robust provision that will allow us to continue to get the best scientific information, to be able to monitor our actions, to make sure that we not only pass the best legislation with the science available, but we have also the collection of information continuing to make sure we make the necessary adjustments, that we achieve the objectives that we set out to do. We all know about corn ethanol and the consequences of that decision, which is not exactly as we intended when we first went forward with that proposal. So I hope as part of the hearing process that we're going forward with, that we will incorporate in legislation that we ultimately pass the type of support for the people that are witnesses today to be able to make available not only to us but to the American people the information necessary to make sure we achieve the objectives that'll be good not only for our environment, but good for our economy and good for our national security. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing, and to our witnesses for being here. I started my day yesterday with a 14-year-old girl from Minneapolis named Liza, who rode her bike 1,500 miles across the country with a group of petitions signed by 1,200 kids from across the country asking for more research and technology encouragement of fuel-efficient vehicles, specifically electric and hybrid cars. And it really made me, she came up with this idea in April. She got a bike. She got her family to follow behind her in a car, and she did this all by herself. And it made me think once again about how a lot of times the kids are leading the way on this and trying to push some of the people here in Washington to get something done. I can tell you that in our state of Minnesota, we believe in science. I've often told my fellow committee members here that we brought the world everything from the pacemaker to the Post-it note. We're the home of the Mayo Clinic. And that's why, Dr. Trenberth, I'm specifically interested in some of your testimony about the science, about the heavy rainfalls and what some of the warming, the increased levels of warm, moist air coming out of the Gulf of Mexico is doing to the environment. I've been surprised, not just kids on bicycles, but at the number of adults that have brought up the issue of climate change to me after we had the flooding in southern Minnesota and in Iowa. We've had an increase in tornadoes. And again, they know that it may not just be because of climate change, or it may not be because of climate change, but they want to know the facts, and it's starting to get into their heads that this may have something to do with what's going on, that storms that maybe were once every 500 years suddenly seem that they're happening 2 years in a row. Second reason I'm so interested in this is just as a former prosecutor, I've always believed in evidence, and it appears that the administration, Mr. Bernay, has been living in an evidence-free zone, and I've just been interested in following the stories about your emails and how they've been somehow contained, about the lengths that have been taken by the administration to squash any kind of an endangerment finding. And it seems to me that what keeps happening is that when they don't like the answer, they try to squash the science. You know, we had this happen when the head of the Center for Disease Control testified, and her testimony seemed rather limited and stilted, and then it turned out some whistleblower came out and gave us the right testimony, and here it had been redacted. And one of my most interesting facts, and one of the things redacted, was that climate change, while it wouldn't cause the wildfires, could lead to increased and more vociferous wildfires on the Pacific coast. And the same week that it was redacted was the week when the wildfires were raging in California a year ago. Of course, we've had that happen again. So it just seems like time and time again, including what we've heard of what happened with you, Mr. Bernay, they don't like the answer. So they squash the science. They don't like the answer about the wildfires, they squash the testimony. They don't like the answer about what's in your email, they squash the email. And I think the American people and that little 14-year-old girl are really owed an answer here, and that's what I hope we'll hear from this hearing. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Whitehouse.
Well, I can't top Liza, and I'd like to get to the witnesses, so I will withhold any opening statement.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, I want
Yes,
the
sir.
record to reflect that the time that I took, 55 seconds, it was nice of Larry to sacrifice all of his time.
It was.
Thank you, Frank.
It was.
I'm Senator Roberts, Senator.
All right. Let me say this. Because this is an oversight investigation where we will be doing fact-finding, we'll be swearing in all of our witnesses today. Therefore, please stand, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect everyone said I do. And we'll begin with Mr. Burnett. We're going to try to hold you to, again, the 5 minutes because I know there are many, many questions. So let me introduce to everybody who we have here. Jason Burnett, private citizen, former Associate Deputy Administrator, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We have then Dr. Kevin E. Trenberth, head of the Climate Analysis Section, National Center for Atmospheric Research, Climate and Global Dynamics Division, and Dr. Roy Spencer, Principal Research Scientist, Earth System Science Center, University of Alabama in Huntsville. And we'll begin with you, Mr. Burnett.
Madam Chairman, Senator Craig, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the science of climate change and its implications. My name is Jason Burnett. I recently resigned my position as Associate Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, where I had helped lead the effort to respond to the Massachusetts versus EPA Supreme Court decision and to help design the resulting greenhouse gas regulations. I'm appearing before this committee as a private citizen, and my opinions for how the country should respond to climate change are mine alone. The scientific information I present, however, is not my opinion. It is the conclusion of peer-reviewed reports produced or endorsed by the U.S. government. As the saying goes, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. A central point I would like to make this morning: we can and must do a better job of differentiating between the facts of a problem and the opinions about how to address the problem. The first question in the climate debate is primarily in the realm of science. What is the nature and the extent of the problem? The U.S. government relies on a wealth of information produced by thousands of scientists, resulting in reports by dozens of government authors and reviewers. The second question is primarily one of policy judgment. What should be done to address the problem, given this scientific assessment? Ultimately, this is the charge of our elected officials and the people they appoint to administer our laws. Both the process of scientific inquiry and the policy process have uncertainties and legitimate differences of opinion. But we should not allow the desire for a particular policy outcome to cloud our assessment or presentation of the problem at hand. In this regard, I feel I made a key contribution in the climate change debate in helping the government draw a clear line between science and policy. As recent news reports have suggested, this assignment was not always easy in this administration. What we should expect from our government is a fair and honest presentation of the facts, and then have a public debate about what solutions to offer, given those facts. Allow me to set the stage. The April 2nd, 2007 Massachusetts versus EPA Supreme Court decision fundamentally, profoundly, and permanently changed the regulatory landscape by finding that greenhouse gases are air pollutants within the Clean Air Act. Under that decision, EPA must determine if greenhouse gases endanger the public. And if so, EPA must regulate emissions from cars and trucks if those emissions contribute to the problem. The law is straightforward. If the public is endangered, the government must act. In June of 2007, EPA Administrator Steve Johnson asked if I would return to the agency to help him lead the effort to respond to the Supreme Court decision and develop the first federal greenhouse gas regulations. Having left EPA less than a year before caused me to be cautious and view with skepticism any suggestion that the administration had decided to take regulatory action. However, it was a unique opportunity to help with a profound policy challenge, and I accepted the invitation. The initial matter before EPA was how to make an endangerment finding. Working with other expert agencies across the government, EPA produced a science assessment to inform that finding. These are among the key conclusions of that assessment. Climate warming may increase the possibility of large, abrupt, and unwelcome regional or global climatic events such as the disintegration of the Greenland ice sheet or collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Severe heat waves are projected to intensify in magnitude and duration over portions of the U.S. where these events already occur, with likely increases in mortality and morbidity, especially among the elderly, the young, and the frail. To be balanced, I will add that climate change is also projected to bring some benefits, such as fewer deaths from cold exposure. To my knowledge, EPA successfully defended any efforts to delete sections of this assessment, which was made public as a sixth-order draft earlier this month. The science is clear on this point. The U.S. will experience serious human health and environmental consequences from climate change. The science assessment provided the support for answering the Supreme Court and making an endangerment finding. Given the profound consequences of such a finding, we worked to ensure that we had agreement across the federal government.
Let me give you and each of you 2 more minutes.
Thank you, Senator.
Go ahead.
The policy process culminated in a cabinet-level meeting in November 2007, where agreement was reached that greenhouse gases did endanger the public and therefore require regulation. The administration also accepted that a finding of endangerment would have deep consequences, and the initial decisions for how to apply the Clean Air Act would set the stage for years to come. But lacking a desire to implement the existing law, the administration left the important decisions about how best to move forward to the next administration and the next Congress. In the end, the only way to avoid making a positive endangerment finding was to avoid making any finding at all. And that is what this administration has decided to do. Intent on not using the Clean Air Act, the White House could only find a way to delay its use. That should signal to everyone that it is simply a matter of time before a positive endangerment finding is made and regulation under the Clean Air Act is triggered. That is, unless Congress passes a new, better law. In closing, I think that we are at the end of the debate about whether greenhouse gases endanger the public. They clearly do so. I look forward to the next phase of the debate about how we should respond. There are no easy answers, and a serious response will require hard work, compromise, and sacrifice. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I ask that my written testimony be submitted for the record. I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burnett. And Dr. Trenberth, you will be given 7 minutes. Go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the committee. I'm pleased to appear before you today to provide an update on climate change. My name is Kevin Trenberth. I was the coordinating lead author of Chapter 3 of the Fourth Assessment Report of the IPCC, the same body that received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 with Al Gore. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the IPCC, but I will simply note that it is a very open and thorough process, and it's inherently conservative in its findings because of the nature of the process. My main message today is that climate change from human influences is a real problem today, and it could have major consequences beyond those already seen. In fact, rather than slowing down, the problem is accelerating. Carbon dioxide emissions are increasing and raise the specter of future climate changes that could be much larger and come much sooner than the IPCC suggests. The problem is that carbon dioxide has a long lifetime in the atmosphere, and so it builds up, and it presently is 36% above pre-industrial levels, and half of that increase has occurred since 1970. The climate system, especially the oceans and the land ice, the major glaciers, has a lot of inertia, and it responds slowly. And so what we've already done to now, we're guaranteed to have at least another degree Fahrenheit warming in the global mean temperatures. And also there is inertia in the infrastructure, so that if we take actions now, we will have even more already in the pipeline. This means that long lead times are essential for actions to address climate change, something which is not widely appreciated by the general public. Now, in my written testimony, I outline the evidence for global warming with several updates on post-IPCC developments, and I'd like to run through some of those right now. To paraphrase the IPCC report, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and it is very likely due to human activities. This word unequivocal was passed by all of the governments that were present, including the U.S., in the Paris meeting. Also, the observed changes in recent decades are reproduced in climate models and are projected to increase in the future with substantial impacts. Nature continues to provide evidence that is under duress, and the impacts are affecting people and animals. Now, my interpretation of the recent events is in the context of the IPCC findings, and it includes, firstly, 6 out of the 10 warmest years in the contiguous United States have occurred since 1998, and globally, the past 7 years are among the 8 warmest on record. Secondly, the most dramatic climate event recently has been the huge loss of Arctic sea ice in 2007, and this affects permafrost in surrounding areas as well as polar bears and other native species. Sea level rise, I think, is the best single indicator of a warming planet, and it continues at a rate of a foot a century. Changes in ocean acidity accompany the buildup in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, with consequences for sea creatures, and bleaching of corals occurs in association with the warming. In the first 6 months of 2008, record heavy rains and flooding in Iowa, Ohio, and Missouri led to overtopped levees that have occurred along the Cedar River in Iowa and in the Mississippi, and they point to the increases in intensity of rains that has been observed around the world, and especially across the United States, in association with more water vapor in the atmosphere. That is a direct consequence of warming. The record-breaking numbers of tornadoes and deaths in the United States in 2008 probably also has a global warming component from the warm, moist air coming in out of the Gulf of Mexico into the Midwest. Longer dry spells also accompany warming as the extra heat that's available goes into evaporating moisture, drying and wilting vegetation. And the risk of wildfire increases enormously. And wildfires in California earlier this year and again this summer are examples of the impacts. In 2007, for the first time, 2 Category 5 hurricanes made landfall in the Americas. They both were in Central America. They didn't get much attention in the U.S. as a result. Recent devastation in Typhoon Nagas in Myanmar, Burma, and also the Typhoon Fangsheng in the Philippines are signs of lack of adequate preparation for the consequences that are already going on of global warming. In the Atlantic in 2008, in July, Hurricane Bertha has broken several records on how early and how far east it formed, and it's the longest-lasting July hurricane on record. We should not be misled by short-term natural climate variations such as the La Nina, the cold sea temperatures that developed in the tropical Pacific that has dominated patterns over this past year. Global warming is not just a threat for the future. It's already happening, and at rates faster than the IPCC projects. It's affecting people and ecosystems and public health, and our predictions at NCAR, my institution, and in the IPCC are for substantial climate changes into the future to the point where the Earth could become a different planet by 2100. I believe there's a crisis of inaction in addressing and preparing for climate change. Global warming is happening, as I often say in my talks, coming ready or not. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee concerning the science of global climate change, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have today or in the future.
Thank you, Doctor. And now, Dr. Roy Spencer.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to address the committee. There's 2 issues I want to talk about. First, I'd like to address the role of the White House in policy-relevant research performed by government employees, which this committee is obviously concerned with today. As a NASA employee performing climate change research during the Clinton-Gore administration, I was told what I could and could not say during congressional testimony. Since it was well known that I was skeptical of the view that mankind's greenhouse gas emissions are mostly responsible for global warming, I just assumed that this advice was to help protect Vice President Gore's political agenda on the subject. But this did not particularly bother me, since I knew that as an employee of an executive branch agency, NASA, my boss ultimately resided in the White House, and to the extent that my work had policy relevance, it seemed entirely appropriate to me that the privilege of working for NASA included a responsibility to abide by direction from my superiors. But when I finally did tire of the limits on my interactions with Congress and the press, I resigned from NASA in 2001 and assumed my present position as a university employee, where I have more freedom to speak on climate issues. Now, secondly, today, and more importantly, I'd like to present some of the latest scientific research regarding the relative roles of mankind and nature in climate change. As you might know, there remains considerable uncertainty over just how sensitive the climate system is to our greenhouse gas emissions. But now we have peer-reviewed and published evidence, both theoretical and observational, that climate sensitivity estimates previously diagnosed from satellite data have been too high. The 2 papers describing that work are referenced in my written testimony. And furthermore, in recent weeks, I believe we have attained what has been called the holy grail of climate research, which is a true measurement of climate sensitivity. We have discovered why previous sensitivity estimates have been so high and so uncertain. They have been contaminated by natural cloud variability. And we have even developed 2 methods of removing that contamination. An analysis of 6 years of our latest and most accurate NASA satellite data reveals evidence of very low climate sensitivity. When translated into an estimate of future global warming, it would be less than 1 degree C by 2100, well below the range of the IPCC's estimates of future warming. If this new evidence of low climate sensitivity is indeed true, it also means, and this is very important, if we have low climate sensitivity, that also means that the radiative forcing being caused by the CO2 we've put into the atmosphere is not nearly enough to explain the warming we've seen in the last 100 years. There must be also some sort of natural warming mechanism involved. And this is where the IPCC process has failed us. The IPCC has been almost totally silent on potential natural explanations for global warming. Although they mention a couple of external influences, such as volcanic eruptions and small fluctuations in solar output as possible minor players, but they have totally ignored the 800-pound gorilla in the room: natural, internal, chaotic fluctuations in the climate system. In my written testimony, I show with a simple climate model a simple example of how small cloud variations associated with two known modes of natural climate variability, the El Niño-La Niña phenomenon and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, might explain 70% of the global average warming in the last 100 years, as well as its basic character, the warming that was experienced until 1940, slight cooling or constant temperatures till about the 1970s, and then resumed warming up until recently, since the satellite data shows that warming stopped about 7 years ago. But as Dr. Trenberth mentioned, short-term results are no indication of future potential. Now, while these new results that I'm talking about are not yet published, I did present them in a seminar to about 40 climate researchers at the University of Colorado last week, and I received no serious objections to my analysis. It seems that the IPCC leadership has a history of ignoring natural climate variability. I often wonder what evidence for natural sources of warming might have been found if the same amount of money and manpower was put to the task as the IPCC has used over the years. After all, remember, the IPCC is tasked with dealing with the human influence on climate, so they don't have a whole lot of motivation for finding possible natural explanations. There's a story I'd like to relate to you, and I've never told it before. In the early days of the IPCC, I was visiting the head of the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, the director, Dr. Robert Watson, who later became the first chairman of the IPCC. He informed me and a work associate with me that since we now had started to regulate ozone-depleting substances under the 1987 Montreal Protocol, the next goal in his mind was to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning. This was nearly 20 years ago. There was no mention of the scientific basis for that goal. So as you can see from the beginning of the IPCC process, it has been guided by desired policy outcomes, not science. I believe that most of the scientists involved in the IPCC are indeed reputable and honest, but they have been used by politicians, bureaucrats, and a handful of sympathetic and outspoken scientists. In conclusion, I am predicting today that the theory that mankind is mostly responsible for global warming will slowly fade away in the coming years, as will the warming itself. And I trust you would agree, Madam Chair, that such a result deserves to be greeted with relief. That concludes my testimony, and I'd be willing to answer any questions.
Okay, we're going to, before you start my time, this is the list how I'm going to call on people. After I finish my questions, Senator Craig, then, unless there's an objection, Senators Lautenberg, Cardin, Klobuchar, Whitehouse, and Sanders. Is that acceptable for everybody? Okay. And we're going to give each of us 6 minutes. Mr. Spencer, did you quit NASA when Bill Clinton was president or George Bush was president?
I believe when George Bush was president.
Okay. I also want to point out that on your own blog, you said you never were told you couldn't speak about your scientific views. And I think that's really key, because what we have happening now is the scientific views are being censored. And lastly, I guess it's a certain congratulations, Rush Limbaugh referred to you as the official climatologist of the Rush Limbaugh Excellence in Broadcasting Network.
Yeah, that's a tongue-in-cheek reference.
Right, but I just wanted to point that out for people to understand. You know, we know that Mr. Burnett has been forthcoming about his problems and where he stands, and I just want to make sure everybody knows what's really happening. Mr. Burnett, you know, one of the things I said in my opening is that we need to get started on this. And I said that since the president has decided not to, and obviously you confirmed that, saying they're just kicking this to the next administration, one way we could get started is if they sign the waiver. That's why that waiver decision was so crucial. They're doing nothing. the states, almost 19 of them, want to act. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, mostly yes or no's, but I want to get the record clear because I'm having trouble getting everything that was promised to me by Mr. Johnson. He promised emails. We're getting nothing, and we're going to talk about that, colleagues, on Thursday when I hope we may have to subpoena these documents. But let me ask you, did Administrator Johnson discuss with you his plan in December '07 to inform the White House that he wanted to move forward with at least a partial waiver for California?
Yes, we had a two-part plan. If the Clean Air Act remained as is, specifically the relevant section of the Clean Air Act was not amended by Congress, the plan was to move forward with a partial grant of the waiver. However, if Congress chose to amend the Clean Air Act, then of course we would have to evaluate the new law.
Okay. In order to support the plan to grant the partial waiver, did Administrator Johnson indicate that the compelling and extraordinary conditions needed to meet the test to grant California the waiver and the other states, that test had been met?
As part of the plan to grant a partial waiver, certainly it was the case that all three criteria in the Clean Air Act would be met, including the criteria that California has compelling and extraordinary circumstances.
Did you prepare Administrator Johnson for a meeting at the White House on the California waiver? And did he communicate to you that he understood there was no reasonable defense of a denial of the California waiver and that a denial was likely to lose in the courts?
First, on the issue of the legal vulnerability, I think that materials from our Office of General Counsel have stated that it is highly likely a denial will lose in court, and that was certainly communicated in multiple fora to the Administrator Johnson.
Okay. After returning from the White House, did Administrator Johnson inform you, or were you aware for any other reason, that the President of the United States had asserted the policy position that there should be only one emission standard applicable to vehicles, despite the requirements of the Clean Air Act?
Yes. The President Bush had made it clear through a variety of mechanisms of his policy preference for a single standard and an approach that would not be consistent with Administrator Johnson granting the waiver. That was made clear in a variety of conversations and also was reiterated in the Statement of Administration policy as part of the debate on the energy bill.
And just for the record, the Clean Air Act has always, well, since I think it's the 70s, said that this waiver process should be able to move forward and that there wouldn't be a patchwork, but there would be one federal standard, and if California decided to move in a tougher direction, that would open the door for other states to follow. Is that correct?
Yeah, the basic structure of the Clean Air Act is that California alone can design a different system from the federal system, and then other states have a choice of either following California or continuing to use the federal system.
Okay. Did Administrator Johnson make it clear to you that the energy bill and its outcome were a consideration in his decision on the waiver?
The energy bill certainly was a consideration, and it was provided as the policy context, if you will, for the denial of the waiver. That policy context was articulated in a letter from Administrator Johnson to Governor Schwarzenegger on December 19th, 2007.
And it was interesting to me because the Supreme Court clearly said any action by DOT has nothing to do with the obligations of the EPA. So when he came before us and talked about that, we were very shocked. Did the administrator commission an analysis comparing the energy bill to the California waiver?
Yes, as the energy bill was moving its way through both houses of Congress, there was a comparison done at Administrator Johnson's request of the fuel economy requirements of the energy bill compared with the effective fuel economy requirements of the California program. Now, that comparison was difficult to make, and there are a number of complications in that comparison. The vehicle fleet is different in California. The years of the program are different. The California program phases in more quickly than the federal program. And so we attempted to perform a comparison, but that comparison really ultimately was an apples to oranges comparison.
Okay. So my last question, I'm sorry, colleagues, for going a little over time here. Did you recommend that the California waiver be granted, and did you, as the chief climate advisor to the administrator, inform him that the waiver was supported by the law and the facts?
Yes. The California had made, in my mind, a convincing case that it met all three criteria as required by the Clean Air Act. My advice, my recommendation, as well as the advice and recommendation of all other advisors within EPA that I am aware of, was for Administrator Johnson to grant the waiver, or at least grant the first few years of the waiver.
Thank you very much. Senator Craig.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Dr. Spencer, let me only make comment and then ask you a brief question. Being politically incorrect in today's climate change debate is not necessarily popular. It isn't popular before this committee sometimes. It isn't popular in the world of public opinion. So as an outsider, if you will, but a scientist, on climate change, what does the scientific community around climate change think of your findings and your expressions?
I receive really no negative direct input from the scientists that are qualified to cast judgment on my published research. It's usually met with silence, which in the past I've found usually means that you're making good points that people don't want to address. Everybody is just silent on the evidence you've put forward.
Well, I thank you for that. I've been a fairly regular attendee of the climate change conferences around the world, and I recognize that it is a thriving cottage industry at times. But thank you for your observation, and please continue your work. There deserves to be reasonable counterpoint to this debate.
Well, there's more like me out there, Senator.
Thank you. Dr. Pronounce your last name again so I don't miss it. No, he's not a scientist. Jason's not a scientist. Sorry.
Trenbeth?
Thank you, Dr. Trenbeth. You gave passing comment as it relates to forest fires and climate change, and I'm frustrated because I see that as an ingredient of tremendous importance in our country. The skies of my state, Idaho, were filled with smoke this weekend, but the smoke wasn't from Idaho. It was from California. And we've seen the tremendous episode California's already had this year. In 1991, a group of scientists met. They just happened to meet in Idaho, but they were forestry scientists, both forest managers and forest scientists. And at that time in 1991, they determined that there were millions of acres of forests in the Great Basin West and in the Sierras that were dead and dying. And as a result, if there was less than any activity in managing these forests, they would result in massive wildfires over the decades to come. Now, of course, because of the tremendous population and fuel buildup in our forest and a slight change in temperature, we're seeing the consequences of that. Last year's forest fires produced about an equivalent of carbon into the atmosphere, upwards of 12 million automobiles operating annually. And yet, very little is said by scientists today as to natural emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. And this Congress denies the Forest Service an active management role in our forest to change the dynamics of forest, even if you accept warming, as I do, and the consequence of that in the lower atmosphere, in the lower elevations in the Great Basin West and in the Sierras. Why aren't scientists dealing more with the consequences, the vegetative consequences, and why aren't they advocating active management to reduce fuel loads and therefore reduce carbon?
Senator, in my own testimony, I actually comment on one way of dealing with the increased risk of wildfire is indeed to cut down on litter and to try to reduce the risk of wildfire. It's something that you do have control over. There are, of course, a lot of natural variations. The things that have come into play in recent years in the West especially is the major drought in 2002 weakened many of the, especially the lodgepole pine, that has subsequently become infested with the bark beetle. And the bark beetle itself is affected by, can be affected by climate and can get killed off if there's a cold spell when the pupa goes into the tree in the beginning of the spring, in the fall, or when it comes out in the spring, if the temperatures are below about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. In the middle of winter, it can also be killed off with a very cold spell of about minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And in recent times, we have not had those. And so there is a warming component to the infestation that has occurred much more recently throughout the West and has increased the risk of wildfire over many other regions as well.
Well, I appreciate that comment. Lodgepole pine are, of course, a climactic species, and we understand their ebb and flow. It's interesting today, the fires in California were not necessarily in the lodgepole areas. They serve, obviously, as ladders sometimes for fire. You're right about bug kill, and you're right about the bug itself. It's also possible to deter that if you interject the human into the process when you recognize it's happening by taking out those bug kill areas so that they don't spread. We're being denied that. I guess that's my point. Active management can help us. Madam Chair, my time is up or nearly up. I thank you. Jason, thank you for being with us. I'd ask unanimous consent that I enter into the record some additional information in relation to Jason Burnett.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Lautenberg.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Spencer, since you ascribe the problems with changing climate to natural causes, is it then suggested that we just kind of throw up our hands and wait and let nature take its course and put our children in the position of the canaries in the coal mine and see if they drop and then decide that the weather has really...
Well, first of all, I'm of the strong professional opinion that most of the warming is due to nature rather than mankind. I don't see how mankind can't have some influence. I mean, after all, the presence of trees on the planet changes the climate compared to if the trees were not, and the Earth to not know that 6 billion people live here. But to the extent that we do influence climate, then of course you're into a policy issue, and you have to look at how difficult it would be to change what we're doing, business as usual. And as I've written before in numerous places on this subject, the way out of this problem, to the extent there's a problem with carbon dioxide emissions, is through technology. It's going to take new technology that we don't currently have, and you cannot legislate new technology into existence. It is created by wealthy societies, wealthy countries, countries that have free market economies, that have the excess wealth to devote to those new technologies. And that's where I think the answer would be, to the extent that carbon dioxide is a problem.
So a poor country like ours would have to wait for those wealthy ones to get...
Well, we already spend billions of dollars, Senator, on new alternative energy research. I don't know why that's never mentioned. Now, maybe we could spend more. I don't know.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burnett, you said in an interview with the House Select Committee on Global Warming that some oil companies, including ExxonMobil, told the administration that moving forward with greenhouse gas emission regulations would, and I quote here, taint President Bush's legacy by having on his legacy an increase of regulations. Is it? Have you heard that?
The basic policy debate within the administration was whether the administration should move forward with a response to the Supreme Court, and most within the administration believed that they would be able to better set the course for the inevitable regulation by moving forward. However, the counterargument was a concern that moving forward would lead to an increase in regulation.
Well,
we are, of course, talking about regulation of greenhouse gases,
Right.
and that is not something that this president wanted to have associated with.
Right. The oil company's assertion that any regulation was unacceptable, even if it was necessary to protect the public's health, is that a proper view of what was taking place?
Well, the question was whether we would go public with a finding that there was endangerment to human health
Or
and
keep
welfare.
it secret as an alternative?
Whether or not to go public, yes.
What's the position of career scientists at EPA, and what is the position of a career scientist?
Well, in fact, it was the position of the administration that the public is endangered by greenhouse gases. We had an extensive policy process within the Environmental Protection Agency and across the federal government that culminated in a cabinet-level meeting where there was agreement that the public was endangered. The question now is simply when that finding will be made public.
Dr. Trenberth, the EPA and other scientific agencies put out a report last week showing real impacts to the United States from global warming. And we have this chart on display here, which I'm sure you've seen. And if not, we'll get you a copy, I promise. Are the findings of this report consistent with the recent findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, such that there shouldn't be any dispute over the reality of global warming and its effects?
I haven't read that report in detail. As far as I can judge, it was very heavily based upon the IPCC report, and as a result, it's probably a couple of years out of date. So it's quite conservative in that regard.
Thank you. Are we, Doctor, approaching a point of no return where it'll be too late to fully protect our people from the impacts of global warming?
Well, global warming consequences are already with us. They're certainly going to continue to happen in the future. We need to recognize that and therefore plan accordingly. I don't think we're doing that, and you can see the evidence of that from the devastation that occurred along the Mississippi with the floods that are overtopped through what scientists have recognized for at least 10, 15 years are the likelihood of much heavier rains. And so what used to be a 500-year flood is now a 30-year flood.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Senator Cardin. I'm going to run out for 1 minute, be right back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Barnett, let me follow up on this, if I might, because I'm reading from your testimony and from your statements here today, in which you underscore, given the profound consequences of making an endangerment finding, we worked to ensure that we had agreement across the federal government. Your written statement then goes through some of the potential alternatives to making an endangerment, some theories that could be used, including actions already taken, and you come to the conclusion that despite these various theories, the administration recognized that the only supportable answer to the Supreme Court was to find that greenhouse gases endanger the public. And then, as you pointed out in response to Senator Lautenberg's question, the policy process culminated in a cabinet-level meeting in November 2007 where agreement was reached that greenhouse gases endanger the public and therefore that regulation was required, from your statement. Were you present at that cabinet-level meeting?
I was not present at the cabinet-level meeting. I was part of the senior team that coordinated the interagency process that began in the summer of 2007 and ran through in preparation for the cabinet level meeting. Administrator Johnson represented, the cabinet level official of EPA, represented the agency at that meeting.
And how were you apprised of the finding at the cabinet level meeting? How did you find out about that?
Well, I had helped prepare the briefing papers for members of the cabinet in preparation for that meeting, and Administrator Johnson and Deputy Administrator Marcus Peacock returned from that meeting and asked for us to draft a regulatory finding that reflected the decisions reached in that meeting. Now, to be extra cautious and certain that, in fact, the finding that we developed reflected those decisions, I took the extra steps of reading portions of that finding to the Office of Management and Budget before it was formally submitted. And then I checked with the head of the regulatory office of OMB to make sure that OMB was ready to receive that finding for formal review. Upon reaching agreement that it was ready for review, I sent it to OMB. We took a number of steps to ensure that it was not simply EPA, but the entire federal government that was in agreement with moving forward with a finding that the public was endangered.
Do you know who was at the cabinet meeting?
I have an understanding from the report back from the meeting who is in attendance, and I certainly know the agencies and departments and offices of the White House that were centrally involved in the policy process throughout most of last year. We had meetings 3 times a week, generally at the old executive office building hosted by OMB and attended by many individuals across the federal government.
So you were confident that the cabinet level meeting in November was an agreement that greenhouse gases endanger the public and therefore regulation was reached at that cabinet level meeting?
Yes, in fact, Administrator Johnson has said he took the extra step of checking with the President's Chief of Staff office and the Deputy Chief of Staff, Joel Kaplan, to make sure that, in fact, that cabinet level meeting was sufficient for Administrator Johnson to announce to staff at EPA that a decision had been made and to proceed with work in drafting the formal document that found that the public was endangered.
And then what happened after that? Why were no regulations issued? Why didn't it go forward?
Well, the series of events over the course of December 5th were strange indeed. That morning, I had made sure that OMB was ready to receive the finding formally for formal review. I had checked with my colleagues at EPA to make sure that there was agreement within EPA that it was ready to be sent over. I sent the document over, and we then received a phone call requesting that we not send the document. We informed the individual that the document had been sent, and we were asked to recall the document.
Asked by whom?
By Deputy Chief of Staff Joel Kaplan to recall the document or send a follow-up note stating that the document had been sent in error. I couldn't do that.
So you were under the you were preparing the necessary paperwork to make the declaration. You were then asked to recall that document?
Yes, sir.
And then what happened next? Did you recall it?
No, sir. It represented the culmination of our policy process, the response to the Supreme Court, and our required action under the Clean Air Act. There was then a period of waiting while the energy bill moved through Congress, and continued debate through early this year about whether this administration wanted to answer the Supreme Court and release the finding, or whether it wanted to allow the next administration to take that action.
So the next thing you know, it was basically punted to the next administration by not making it finding, isn't it?
Ultimately, what the administration has decided to do is issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is not a regulatory action. It is designed in part to solicit public input and in part to make sure that it is the next administration, not this administration, that makes the important decisions about how to move forward with the Clean Air Act.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Senator. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. I seem to make it sound French, Mr. Burnett. I think it's my daughter just returned from French camp, and she will only speak to me in French, and so I'm trying to, it's in my head. It has been the issue that Senator Cardin was raising with you about you sending over this email, was an email, is that correct, to the OMB?
Yes, Senator.
And then this Deputy Chief of Staff, Joel Kaplan, called you and said, take it back or send a note that we didn't send it. Is that right?
To clarify, he called the administrator, and the administrator asked whether I would be able to send a follow-up note upon explaining that it had not been sent in air. There is agreement at EPA that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to send such a note.
And do you know if someone from the White House or someone told him to not open this? Was there someone outside of OMB? Do you know who that person is?
It is my understanding from conversations with individuals at OMB that they were directed not to open the email so that the email would not be in receipt, so that OMB could say that they had not received a finding of public endangerment, and therefore the public transparency provisions of the Clean Air Act and the Executive Order 12866 would not be triggered.
And do you know who ordered them to not open them?
I do not know, since I was not part of that conversation.
Okay. Mr. Burnett, press accounts say that the White House instructed the EPA to change their calculations regarding the cost of greenhouse gas emissions to our society. Why do you think they wanted to minimize the net benefit to society of controlling carbon emissions?
Well, let me first say that the regulation that we were working to develop would have resulted in an increase in fuel economy of the nation's cars and trucks. And that would have resulted in a number of benefits besides reducing greenhouse gases, perhaps most importantly for the current debate about energy prices. It would have reduced the pain at the pump by reducing the quantity of gas that Americans need to put in their tanks. There was a desire for a less aggressive regulation to be put forward by the Department of Transportation rather than a more aggressive regulation that EPA thought that EPA analysis suggested would have been in the benefit of the American people.
The New York Times has written that you went back and forth in memos to OMB over the definition of carbon dioxide molecules. Could you tell me about that debate?
As I stated previously, there was a robust interagency process, and I was at almost all of those meetings hosted by OMB. A number of questions were raised during that process, given the profound ramifications of making an endangerment finding, including the definition of various terms within the Clean Air Act, such as air pollutant or air pollution, or what exactly is meant by the cause and contribute test of the Clean Air Act. All of these terms are important terms, and we wanted to make sure that we got it right, not only for the immediate regulations for cars and trucks, but also because we believed that it would lead to regulations and set the precedent for how regulations were developed for a variety of stationary sources. Over the course of that discussion, there was quite a bit of effort and interest to see whether the Supreme Court case itself and regulation of CO2 and other greenhouse gases from automobiles could be restricted to just regulation of automobiles. How the Clean Air Act works is that after a pollutant is a regulated pollutant, controls are required on a variety of sources. So there was an interest to determine whether we could define CO2 from automobiles as somehow different than CO2 from power plants, for example. Clearly,
Do you think that's possible?
Clearly it wasn't supportable.
And who was trying to argue for that?
Well, several individuals were trying to make that general case.
People within OMB?
Jeff Rosen, as part of the General Counsel's office at OMB, had raised that question multiple times, and I must say that it was sometimes somewhat embarrassing for me to return to EPA and ask for my colleagues to explain yet again that CO2 is a molecule, and there's no scientific way of differentiating between CO2 from a car or a power plant.
Thank you. It's what I was talking about earlier about believing in science, and I appreciate what you've done to stand up for science, and hopefully in the end we will get this done based on science. Dr. Trenberth, just a quick question to follow up. Of course, I'm very interested in this, the flooding issue and these enormous rainfalls that we've had suddenly in the Midwest. We had them last year. We had 8 people die in southern Minnesota, and now we have another one where I stood in front of a huge stretch of road, yards and yards long, that had just collapsed, and a man died trying to get a sump pump. The road collapsed out from under him because of the water. And you talked about the fact that 500-year floods are now 30 to 50-year floods. Okay, could you just expand on that for 1 minute about what we can expect in the future and why this is happening?
Over the past century, rains in the U.S. are up about 7%, but it's not really a linear trend. There was a jump around the 1970s, and it's been running, the rainfall has been running on average that much higher, and that's mainly east of the Rockies. At the same time, the heavy rains, the top 5%, are up 14%, and the very heavy rains, the top 1%, are up 20%. And the main reason is well understood, and it's because there's about 4% more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that's a number which comes directly from about 1 degree Fahrenheit warming over the planet, and so the air can hold more water at a rate of about 4% for every 1 degree Fahrenheit warming.
So the warming causes more water in the atmosphere?
More water vapor. The weather systems reach out, grab that water vapor, concentrate it, dump it down, and so the natural consequence is heavier rains.
Very good for 1 minute. Thank you very much.
I call on Senator Whitehouse. I just was told that the metropolitan Washington area is under a severe weather alert, 40-mile-per-hour winds, lightning, and heavy downpours. Just coincidentally with this, has nothing to do with anything, but I thought I'd throw that out.
Barbara, you arranged these props extraordinarily well.
Thank you, sir. Is that why you were
Mr.
late?
Chairman.
You had a little conversation? Go ahead, Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Boxer. Mr. Burnett, were you at the EPA long enough or in a position adequate to get a sense of what the routine meetings and conversations were between the administrator and the White House?
My focus was
scheduling
on climate and energy policy, and I think that I am generally aware of the conversations and the policy process related to those issues. I can't say that I am personally and substantially familiar with other conversations regarding other issues before the agency.
Were there routine meetings between the administrator and the White House on the California waiver Clean Air Act issue?
There were a number of meetings that the administrator had, a number of meetings that I and others had.
Would you characterize them as routine?
I don't think that there was, well, this was the first vehicle waiver that I was substantially involved with, and so I want to be cautious about not suggesting that I had experience with other waivers.
Let me ask it this way.
But I was familiar with the general policy process for regulations.
Were the meetings that we're talking about related to the California waiver, the Clean Air Act waiver, specific to that, or were they part of a routine schedule that the administrator had going to the White House on a regular basis, and this would be on the agenda this particular time, or were these meetings that were scheduled specifically to address this and not part of a routine, ongoing, scheduled meeting process?
Both. There were some meetings that were specifically scheduled to talk about the California waiver, and other meetings to talk about a range of issues relating particularly to climate policy, including the response to the Supreme Court and the California waiver.
And were there meetings specific to the California waiver that you would not characterize as routine, that were specifically scheduled for that purpose?
Well, there were meetings specifically scheduled for that purpose, as I said.
Not just dropped in as an agenda point on a regularly scheduled meeting?
Yeah, meetings that were specific to talk about the California waiver, but I'm not sure if that means that they were routine or not. It certainly was the case that this issue of the California waiver received a great deal of attention from a number of people throughout the administration.
Would it be accurate to say that in those meetings, Administrator Johnson's contribution was limited to an update on the status of the waiver action?
There was an effort that we were engaged in and that I was engaged in to make the case that it would be appropriate to issue at least a partial grant of the waiver. Ultimately, we were not successful in making that case, and ultimately the administrator decided to deny the waiver.
From your perspective, did the White House understand that the responsibility for addressing and making a decision on the waiver rests with the administrator?
That is an interesting question that has been brought to light in a recent ozone decision where the president reached a different conclusion than the administrator, and the president's policy was ultimately followed.
In the Clean Air Act waiver, after the White House was notified of the proposed decision that you put together, did the White House respond to that notice that you intended to partially grant the waiver?
The response was clearly articulating that the president had a policy preference for a single standard that would be inconsistent with granting the waiver.
That was the response from the White House?
Yes.
And it was a response to the administrator?
That is my understanding of the conversations that the administrator had, and that certainly is the statements that I received directly from individuals in the White House.
Would they have made sense if the administrator weren't aware of them? I mean, it was sort of clearly implicit that this had been communicated to the administrator, correct?
It was,
if not directly through staff.
It was well known, and the administrator certainly knew the president's policy preference for a single standard.
Which had been communicated to him after he had heard the proposal to grant the partial waiver.
We had been working on a variety of options, ranging from a grant to a denial. I thought that the option that had the most prospect of moving forward in this administration was a partial grant of the waiver. And we tried to argue that that could be done in a way that was both legal, legally supportable, and consistent with the general policy direction that we were receiving.
But just in terms of the timing, that the White House response to that followed that notification to the White House that that was your intention. In terms of the order.
Yeah, well, there were multiple meetings, and so I want to simply be cautious about the exact sequence because there was back and forth. But we went forward with our plan, told the White House about our plan to have a partial grant of the waiver, and in response, we were reminded of the President's policy preference.
Got you. Madam Chair, will we have a second round? I have two more questions I'd like to ask, and I'd like to allow Senator Sanders to proceed with his. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you, Senator Boxer, for holding this hearing, and I want to thank the panelists for being here. I'm not going to ask. Right, we've got to vote, and we've got to be out here in about 10 minutes. Okay. So I want to thank the panelists for being. I'm not going to ask Mr. Burnett any questions because I think he has received enough questions. And what he is doing today is important because it only confirms, I think, what many of us have known for years, is that with the Bush-Cheney administration, we have an administration that will go down in history as having the worst record that I can think of any administration in the history of our country, but they have been especially bad and outrageous in environmental matters, and they stand uniquely alone. If you even compare the Bush administration to his father, who was a moderate on these issues, the decisions and actions of this administration will cause incalculable harm for the future, and it's going to take us many, many years, if ever, to recover and reverse what they have done. What I want to do is ask Dr. Trenberth a question. If we do not reverse global warming, and if the planet continues to warm up, and if we see more drought, if we see more flooding, if we see the loss of arable land, if we see mass migrations because people are unable to farm or grow the food that they need, if we see the result, more and more illnesses develop, what happens? Talk a little bit about the impact of human health and global warming.
Of course, what happens is that this doesn't happen everywhere all at once. Usually it happens episodically, and so we see examples like what happened with Katrina in our country, indicating that indeed a Western country leading the world in the United States was not up to, or didn't have the infrastructure to deal with that kind of a disaster. And so this year there have been major disasters in Myanmar, Burma, and the Philippines as a result also of hurricanes. And so these things happen from time to time, and they affect different areas. You read about them in the news, but they don't affect everywhere all at once. The same thing tends to happen with droughts. The droughts move around from one year to the next, and it's easy to say, well, maybe this is natural variability, and natural variability is playing a role. The thing is that we've got, in fact, nowadays, global warming and natural variability going hand in hand. Another really good example was what happened in Europe in 2003. I mean, the magnitude of the heat waves that occurred at that time, there is no way that this, and in Europe they've got records.
And how many people died? My recollection is thousands of people died.
Yes, over 30,000 people. The IPCC suggests up to about 35,000 people died in that particular heat wave. And you cannot account for it by natural variability. You cannot account for it by global warming. It's a combination of both. So it was an extreme natural event on top of global warming that led to that particular
But go
disaster.
beyond just the severe weather disturbances, whether it's a prolonged heat wave or whatever. If you see increased drought, people are not going to be able to grow food, and they're going to have to migrate and so forth. They're going to be more and more disease developing for a variety of reasons. Can you say a few words on that?
Yes, that's correct. There's various kinds of diseases and pests like wheat rusts and cotton rusts that tend to flourish in warmer and wetter conditions. Ironically, we often have droughts and floods at the same time, but in different places, and then they move around from one year to the next. And where they occur get determined by things like the El Nino phenomenon or the La Nina that we've had over the past year. And so these things gradually occur in different places. Everyone will be affected one way or the other sooner or later and in different ways. And the thing that's happened in the last 30 years in particular is that it's gotten a lot warmer in general in Europe and Asia. In the U.S., the main thing that's happened is it's gotten wetter. And there's a figure in my testimony which shows that. And that has ameliorated the drought that we otherwise would have had. There's been some work done to illustrate that. And also, it has not become as hot as it otherwise would have been. But we're extremely vulnerable to both of those things occurring much more in the future if the atmospheric circulation tends to revert to the conditions that occurred before about 1970. And we saw an example of that last year, for instance, in the Southeast with the drought and the consequences of that and the arguments over water between states and so on. And so you'll see more examples of that kind of thing. And I personally think that the biggest pressure point on society will actually be through water and water resources. And that's especially true in other places around the world.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Here's what we're going to do. The information, we're going to continue this hearing because I've got to follow up on some things that were said. The information we've received so far raises serious concerns in my mind regarding the account of events that have been provided to this committee, including statements by Administrator Johnson. And so when I come back, I want to further ask you, and I think it's so important about, Mr. Burnett, the President himself, what I understand, you don't have to answer now because I want you to think about it, the President himself wanted a single standard for automobiles. And what I want you to think about is that flies in the face of the law. And the Supreme Court. So I want you to just think about that because it's very, very important. And when Senator Whitehouse comes back, Bettina, if you could tell him to sit right here, reopen the hearing, and I'll be right back. So we stand in recess just for about 5 or 10 minutes. I'll be right back.
The hearing will come to order. First of all, let me just express for the record my appreciation to Chairman Boxer for allowing me the time to vote in return. And I would like to continue the line of questioning that I had for a moment. Mr. Burnett, you indicated that in your earlier testimony that President Bush made his policy preference for a single standard clear in a variety of conversations and a statement of administration policy. Could you describe what more you know about those conversations and that statement? Is the statement a matter of public record? Is that an administrative document?
Yes, I believe it is.
An OMB circular of some kind, something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
So statements of administration policy generally, well, in that case, were developed as the energy bill, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 was moving through Congress. And that final document made it clear that there was a desire frankly, for clarity as to EPA's role, and that was seen as an effort to push for a legislative fix, if you will, to the Clean Air Act, something that would legislatively deny the California waiver.
Was the statement of administration policy developed in the context of the energy bill, though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
With respect to the cabinet meeting, is there any way that one could describe that cabinet meeting as routine from the perspective of an administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency?
For major policy decisions that EPA makes, we often would have what we call a principals meeting, which is the principal decision maker and the cabinet level officials would get together and would look at the decision before the administrator, and that occurred in this case.
So it wasn't a full-blown cabinet meeting, it was a cabinet level meeting?
That's right. Cabinet level officials, the administrator representing EPA.
And you assisted the administrator in preparing for that, and you assisted in creating the agenda for it and so forth?
I both assisted the administrator in preparing for it, and I assisted OMB in preparing the briefing documents that went out to the other agencies and departments.
Are you aware of any other such cabinet-level meetings on other issues that took place during your time at EPA?
Yes, there were at least 3 cabinet-level meetings related to the response to the Supreme Court. We had a meeting, the administration had a meeting to make the policy decisions about the fuel economy standards and the greenhouse gas standards for cars and trucks, a meeting for the greenhouse gas standards for gasoline and other fuel for the transportation sector, and a cabinet-level meeting for the issue of public endangerment.
Do you know who attended the meeting on the California waiver, the cabinet-level meeting?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't think I said that there was a cabinet-level meeting, at least that I'm aware of, on the California waiver.
It was on the endangerment recommendation?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. And do you know who attended that?
I know generally who attended, and certainly some of the individuals, as well as the offices, agencies, and departments involved.
It was the Administrator and Deputy Administrator Peacock on behalf of the EPA?
Yes, and Roger Martella, the General Counsel, also attended that meeting for EPA.
Without going into individual names, what other cabinet agencies were represented, do you know?
I believe that CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Office of Management and Budget, I believe the CEA, I believe that the Office of the Science Advisor, the Office of the Vice President, the Chief of Staff's Office to the President, I believe the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, and that is neither necessarily a comprehensive list, or I may be incorrect about certain offices, but those were the offices that were generally involved in the policy process, and I believe that all of those offices were at the cabinet level meeting in November of 2007.
Department of Energy, Department of Transportation?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And you indicated that the result coming out of that cabinet level meeting was that you should prepare to go ahead with a finding that the public was in fact endangered.
Yes.
Do you have any information that could help explain how that determination could have gotten out of that group with the Chief of Staff to the President, the Office of the Vice President, and OMB all represented when they seem to be the entities opposed to at least the ramifications of that conclusion, if not that conclusion itself?
Things changed between November of 2007 and December of 2007. The primary thing that changed is that the energy bill was moving its way through Congress, and the prospects for that bill being signed into law were looking better in early December than in November. And ultimately, one of the key reasons that the administration was interested in moving forward with a response to the Supreme Court was to help accomplish the President's objective of reducing gas consumption by 20% over 10 years, the so-called 20 and 10 plan. After it looked like the President could achieve that policy objective without responding to the Supreme Court, then effectively a lot of the support for responding to Massachusetts versus EPA evaporated. EPA still argued that it was in the best interest of the country to move forward with a response because, in fact, the science had not changed and the law had not changed, and the public was still endangered. And therefore, we were required to move forward sooner or later. The decision was simply to delay that response until the next administration.
And going back to the waiver determination, as I recall the timing, that was the administrator's decision without any of the required background or support was announced, sort of explanation to follow, the same day, if I'm not mistaken, that the energy bill was signed into law, if I have my timing right.
Yes, you are correct.
How did that timing happen to occur, to your knowledge?
On Monday, December 17th, the administrator came into my office and told me of his intent to deny the California waiver. I immediately asked him whether we didn't want to continue looking at the option of a partial grant, because even though the energy bill did look good, well, at that point it was clear that it was going to be passed and signed into law. The energy bill was not going to change the three criteria of the Clean Air Act, the three legal criteria that we had to evaluate, and therefore certainly the best legal option was to grant or partially grant the waiver. However, the administrator made clear that he had made up his mind, and we went to work drafting a letter to Governor Schwarzenegger. That letter was in the works over the course of Monday and Tuesday, the 17th and 18th. President Bush signed into law the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 on the morning of December 19th. It was made known to us by, I think, at least two separate news organizations that they had information that the administrator was planning on denying the waiver and that they were going to run a story the next morning. So the decision was made to release the letter to the governor announcing the denial of the California waiver at least a day or two earlier than we had anticipated. The plan, frankly, was to release that letter either later in that week so as to not to not be in the same, at least day, news cycle of the president signing of the energy bill. But given the information that the news organizations had, the decision was made to release that to release the letter to the governor late in the day, Wednesday, December 19th.
Going backwards, there was the release on December 19th. The administrator told you what his decision was on December 17th. When had, if you recall the date, when had you notified, or when did the department, the Environmental Protection Agency, notified the White House of its recommendation to grant a partial waiver? Do you remember what date that was?
I believe that we continued throughout the early December to explain the case for a partial grant. I believe that it was early December when the administrator made his plan known. Of course, that plan ultimately was not followed.
And in between that, the White House response came back that the president desired there to be the single standard.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Trenberth, I'm a little bit at a disadvantage because both you and Dr. Spencer are scientists, and I am not. But I noticed you reacting from time to time to Dr. Spencer's testimony, And I was wondering if there was anything that you would care to say regarding his testimony that would help a non-scientist understand or assess it properly and give it its appropriate context in the global warming / climate change discussion.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond. Firstly, the IPCC has extensively studied natural variability and tried to assess what the natural variability would be without any what we call external influences on the climate. So that includes the sun and things like volcanoes, which are natural sources of variations. And we do that through paleoclimate, and we do that through models. And in fact, it's an important part of the validation of climate models that they should be able to replicate the record in the past and the natural variability in the past. The second point I would make is that natural variability also has a cause. It may be the redistribution of heat within the ocean, but it doesn't come out of, it's not magic. It doesn't come out of nowhere, and we have the ability nowadays to track that. And so, for instance, we can track what's happening on the sun, and we know that the sun is not responsible for the changes that have occurred. We also know that it's not clouds. You know, Einstein said that we should make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think Roy's model is in the latter category. His simple model is simply fatally flawed, in my view. There are two figures in his written testimony, figure 3A and 3B, and just very briefly, the radiation that's contrived there is about a factor of 10 too large. The ocean mix layer that he uses is about a factor of 10 too large, and he starts the model off with an artificial starting point. So unlike the IPCC models that have been scrutinized by hundreds of scientists, and many papers have been written about them, analyzing them and diagnosing what they're doing, Roy's model has no standing whatsoever. And so I don't think I would go along with the statements that he's made. At the same time, you know, clouds are an issue. We need to do clouds better. But my group has also been intensively studying the so-called sensitivity of the climate system, which is, you know, how much the climate system would change in response to a doubling of carbon dioxide. And we use the annual cycle, and what we find is that the climate models that are somewhat more sensitive are the ones that replicate the changes from summer to winter better than the other models. And so we come to quite the opposite conclusion. That's work under development. And so I don't think you should accept the testimony that is in Roy's written testimony as gospel at this point.
Let me ask a final question, if I may, Madam Chair. Now I'm really going to hazard myself by going into potentially scientific areas as, again, a non-scientist. But it strikes me that a lot of things in nature and in science can be described by the famous bell curve. And indeed that the scientific data, if you were to plot it on an X and Y axis, in which the one axis was the severity of the threat and the other axis was the numerosity or consensus of the opinion, you'd end up plotting a curve in which some people at the one low end of the curve thought that this was really, really dangerous, far more than perhaps the IPCC as a consensus judgment might admit. And there are other people at the other end of the bell curve saying that it's actually, you know, very low risk. But at both ends, it's a relatively small number, and the consensus is sort of right down the middle where the IPCC conclusions lie. Do you believe that that is, as far as you know, do you believe that that is an accurate way to look at or try to understand the varying scientific opinion and its relative weight on this question?
Well, there are certainly some scientists who take much more extreme views than I do as to how seriously the planet is in peril. And there are some who are, and the IPCC includes scientists from all parts of the political spectrum, I might say, and it includes many skeptics are involved in the IPCC process. What I have found, though, and I've given about 40 public lectures over the last couple of years in dealing with people, and some of these are very technical people, like 700 engineers, IEEE engineers, is that they really appreciate the information on which the IPCC is based. And once they become adequately informed, they become convinced, indeed, that there is a real problem here. And it's the ones that, in general, are not well informed about the basic information, and the complexity of the climate system doesn't make that an easy process. Those are the ones who are more inclined to be skeptical.
Well, here's my concern. It's sort of a political and practical concern to a degree. I see us as being an environment in which we are hearing a great deal from people who are, like the IPCC and like yourself, sort of right down the middle, right at the high point of the bell curve with respect to the concerns about the severity of what we have to look forward to from climate change. Then we hear from people like Dr. Spencer, who have a different view, that it's going to be much more moderate, not going to be really a problem, and only 1 degree increase by 2100 and so forth. And in Washington, which is a city built around compromise, there may be a tendency to sort of hedge between those two views. And I think that will build in a bias towards inaction that would be very dangerous if we didn't reflect that for every Dr. Spencer, there is somebody on the other side of the bell curve whose views are far more profoundly concerned about the threat of climate change than those of the IPCC and those of yourself. And again, asking for your comment, is that a fair way to look at the sort of lay of the land on this?
In that regard, the IPCC is a very open process. Anyone can be involved, and it is the consensus view as to what is happening. There are a few people, and Roy is among them, who are dissent from that view, but as Senator Klobuchar was saying, there's a lot of facts and hard evidence and good information that can be brought to bear on this problem. And when you do that, some of the things that Roy's been saying can be simply disproved.
My time has more than expired. I'm very, very grateful to the chair for her patience and courtesy, and I yield.
So important. I hope, Senator, if you could possibly stay, because I think we need to talk after this is over. When I left, Mr. Burnett, I said that I was going to ask you, and I want to say this, I'm going to sort of tell a story. If there's anything in that story that I'm saying wrong, I want you to correct me, please. And this is the story. The story is that under the Clean Air Act, and it's in this book, under a section called waiver, it says the administrator shall, after notice and opportunity, waive application of this section to any state which has adopted standards for the control of emissions from new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines, and it goes on, that if those standards are at least as protective of the public health, and there's only 2 reasons given, essentially, for denying such a waiver. The first is the determination of the state is arbitrary and capricious, and the second, B, is, I guess there's 3, such state does not need such state standards to meet compelling and extraordinary conditions, or such state standards and accompanying enforcement procedures are not consistent with Section 7521 of this title. So this is the Clean Air Act. And here's my story. California and about 19 other states evidenced interest in going along with this, asked for such a waiver because they're concerned about global warming, because they want to get started doing more than the federal government, just get going to cut down on global warming emissions, and that after many meetings, Mr. Burnett, and make sure that I'm right when I say this, many meetings of the scientists at the EPA, of people like yourself, and even meetings, as I understand it, with others, the cabinet people and others, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, EPA decided that it would make sense to grant a partial waiver to the state, and the partial has to do with the number of years, as I understand it, that it would be in effect. So far, is that a correct recitation?
I want to be careful about
Go ahead.
the word decided, because it's my understanding under the law that ultimately the administrator doesn't make a decision until he
Okay.
puts pen to paper. But it is true that we had a plan, and the administrator had a plan
Right.
to grant.
Well, let me put it this way. The
first few
EPA
years.
decided to recommend to the administration a partial waiver. Is that a better way to say it? They decided to recommend this partial waiver.
The administrator had a plan to partially grant the waiver, provided that the Clean Air Act was not
Oh,
amended by
he
Congress.
planned to do it, and he was going to just let the administration know about it. Is that correct?
Yes,
About his decision,
He,
or his plan?
yes, that's right.
Okay.
He
So I won't use the word decision. This is why I'm trying to tell the story in exactly the right way. He had a plan to sign a partial waiver, and he went over to the White House to inform them of this decision, of this plan, that you were intimately involved in getting him prepared for this meeting, and he went over there, and this is what I'm trying to get now. When he came back, he let people like yourself know, I assume there were others, that the president wanted a single standard for, is it for fuel economy or for controlling greenhouse gas emission from cars? How would I say it best?
The president had a policy preference for a single standard for automobiles.
Okay. A single standard. And so my question to you is it your understanding that the president understood this law? Did he make reference to it? Did he say despite the law or anything like that, despite the law or notwithstanding the law?
I cannot personally speak about
Okay.
Conversations
Okay.
at that level. What I
Okay.
do know is that I was involved as part of the process explaining to a number of officials at the White House the three criteria under the Clean Air Act.
Right, that I read.
And
So
our
to your
judgment that
best
those
of
were-
your understanding, Mr. Johnson understood clearly the Clean Air Act when he went over to the White House.
This issue is one of the most important issues that was facing EPA, and it received very high-level attention, many meetings with the administrator, and many meetings with senior officials at the White House, yes.
Okay.
Everyone.
Let me put it this way. Is there any information that you have when Mr. Johnson reported back to you about the president didn't want to follow this plan? Was there any doubt in your mind that the president didn't understand the law? I mean, just forget conversations. I mean, was it pretty clear that the president and his folks had understood what the law required and they chose this single standard?
We did our best to ensure that all policy officials involved in this decision were apprised and informed of the law and EPA's assessment that all three criteria were that clearly the most supportable case under the law is that all three criteria had been met.
Okay. So to finish my story, this issue had generated a tremendous amount of interest. It was certainly very important in this committee. We were talking about a lot with Mr. Johnson. And that if I were to say to my constituents that the professionals in the EPA and even Mr. Johnson himself had a plan to grant a partial waiver, they presented that plan, and despite what the law requires, The president chose to ignore that plan and said he didn't want to grant the waiver. Is that a layman's way of putting it?
Again, I want to be very careful about the words that I use.
Well, these are my words,
if-
not yours. These are my words. If I were to say to my constituents, from what I've gathered, very clearly, because I don't have the documents I want. You know, that's another problem. We can't get the documents we want on this. We've asked for emails, so you're the only thing we have
The
standing
policy,
up for what happened. So let me say again, if I were to say to my constituents that Mr. Johnson and his key team and the professionals at EPA felt California had made their case, and furthermore, if there was a lawsuit, the probability was that they would prevail, and yet and still, knowing all this, and despite the fact that there is a Clean Air Act which lays out the case, the president chose not to grant the waiver. That's my words. If I were saying that to my constituents, how would you correct me?
the policy preference of the president led to the denial of California's waiver request because granting the waiver or a partial grant of the waiver would have led to two standards, not one, as the president desired.
Right. And isn't it true that in the Clean Air Act, it's very clear that there have been 50 waivers granted already. California's never been denied. The other states have never been denied. This wasn't anything new. This was the first outright denial. Is that correct?
That is correct. It is the most clear reading of the law that California should have and should still receive its waiver request, despite the policy preferences of the president.
Okay. I want to submit to the record, and I think Senator Whitehouse would be very interested in this. First of all, the opinion of the court, which clearly says the fact that DOT, that's the Department of Transportation's mandate to promote energy efficiency by setting mileage standards, may overlap with EPA's environmental responsibilities, in no way licenses EPA to shirk its duty to protect the public health and welfare. Now, I'm not asking Mr. Burnett or anybody else anything. I'm saying here, as a United States Senator who is sworn to uphold the laws, I just want to say to my colleague, the Supreme Court said, no matter what standard is set by DOT, EPA must not shirk its responsibilities to the public health and welfare. Despite this, and despite everything that the good professionals and scientists had done, this president, I believe, made a decision that flies in the face of the Supreme Court case. So I believe it is clearly unlawful. Clearly unlawful. And I think the importance of having Mr. Burnett here is to get the behind the scenes before this bad decision was made by this president. This, what I call unlawful decision, was made by this president. That is my opinion, that he was strongly advised not to do it. And the reason I'm so grateful to you, Mr. Burnett, is I can't tell you how hard it's been for us to connect the dots. We gathered certain things happened because we got Mr. Johnson's calendar, and we saw the day he went over to the White House. And we tried to piece it together. It looked to us like the EPA had told him to go forward. We had some information on that, but it wasn't complete. You are helping us connect the dots. I know it's very difficult for you, and I know you are cautious in every word you say, and you should be, and you have been, and the record will certainly show that. What you have helped us to do is to fill out the picture. I just have...
Madam Chair?
Yes.
If I may, I have left the agency in early June and plan on continuing to work on the same issues. I think that there is a profound challenge for the next administration in two regards that flow from decisions this administration has made. First, I think it is clear that either the courts or the next administration will grant California the waiver. However, this temporary denial of the waiver creates complications both for California, the other states that have chosen to follow California's lead, and ironically, for the very industry that is directly affected, the automobile industry, because the denial will eliminate the phase-in period of the program and overall will make a program harder to meet, not easier to meet. So it's really a disservice not only to the environment but actually to the industry. And the challenge will be for the next administration to try to sort out how to deal with the ramifications of the denial and move forward with a grant in a way that works as best as possible for all parties involved. The other challenge, of course, is a response to the Supreme Court. This administration has simply decided to delay that response, but it is going to be a complicated, difficult task to use the Clean Air Act, but that is what the law requires. And it is my personal judgment that we are best served starting now to begin developing a path forward so that we can best use the Clean Air Act and avoid the parade of horribles that other people have suggested will come from the Clean Air Act. A responsible use of the law, it can be done to channel regulation in a way to avoid that scenario.
Well, thank you so much for getting us back to why we're here. We want to be able to move forward, and as we all know, every day we waste is a day that we can't make up for. It's because that carbon stays out there. So let me just, since you brought up the endangerment finding, essentially, I want to close on this and then read a statement. And I will, yes, I will ask you a question, then I will turn to, we have time, turn to Senator Whitehouse. Now, one of the things, as you know, everybody, we're going to have a meeting here on Thursday where we are attempting to get the email that contained the endangerment finding, and you were involved in preparing that email. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. I was involved both in preparing the endangerment finding itself, and I was the individual who sent the email for formal OMB review.
Right. It is my understanding that if that email had been opened by the Office of Management Budget over there at the White House, it would have triggered an obligation to reveal its contents to the public. Is that your understanding?
It is my understanding under the Clean Air Act, I believe it's Section 307D, and the Executive Order 12866, which was a President Clinton executive order but has been reaffirmed by this president, that there are public transparency provisions that require drafts of regulations submitted for review to OMB to be made public so that the public can understand any differences between the draft submitted for review and the final regulation released. It is my understanding that by submitting this finding for formal review, that would have triggered the public transparency provisions of both the law and the executive order, and that the email and the contents of the email, the finding of public endangerment, would be made public upon the administrator's signature of a document for the Federal Register notice.
Well, you know, me speaking here, the fact is, all along we've seen a pattern and a practice of this administration to cover up any finding that deals with the impacts of unchecked global warming on our people. We saw it with the CDC testimony, and I wanted to thank you for letting the public know about that. You were asked personally to redact that CDC testimony. You said in the press you wouldn't do it, and it wound up that it was done, where was it done, in the OMB? Yeah, we're not exactly sure who redacted it. Do you know who redacted those 6 pages of Dr. Gerberding's testimony?
I do not. I can only
Right.
speak for my actions.
It was not the EPA. So what happened was, and that's the one where Dana Perino said it was, what was his name? Dr. Marburger, and Dr. Marburger said he didn't do it. So it's just like, did the butler do it? You know, we don't, we don't know. But the bottom line is, yeah, in the parlor with the candlestick. Well, what we need is a candle to light a little, put a little light on the subject. We can't find out this information. So your email that you sent was never opened. This is me speaking. I believe in part to keep what you found from the public, and I know you've said you don't have a copy of it. So Thursday, we're going to meet here, and we're going to try and subpoena that endangerment finding, that document. Now, we need 2 of our Republican friends to show up, and we need 4. We need 8 senators, but only 2 Republicans? 8 Ds and 2 Rs because of the larger Senate. 8 senators and 2 Republicans. 8 Democratic senators and 2 Republican senators need to show up. And then I guess we need a majority of those present and voting to subpoena this document. This isn't easy, and I have avoided this because I know on the House side it's a little easier for the majority, but they can't get the document. The only thing they were allowed to do, as I understand it, is read it, not take any notes. One person. And I'm not going there. Nobody made me, queen of this committee. If we can't get this for everybody to see, that's not an offer I take. It has to be made public. This is about public endangerment. So I'm going to call on Senator Whitehouse to ask a couple more questions, and then I have a closing statement, and I so appreciate your all being here. Senator, please go ahead.
Just one very quick question. Mr. Burnett, do the procedures of the Clean Air Act relative to granting or denial of waivers anywhere provide for a policy preference of the president to enter into that process?
First, I should say, be clear, I am not a lawyer.
That's okay. I'm not a scientist, and I've been messing around with that.
I think that your question does involve at least a matter of administrative law. It is.
Let me ask it to you in a non-legal way. Let me ask it to you just in a factual way. Then, in the course of preparing Administrator Johnson for this, in the course of preparing the decision that was made to recommend that a partial waiver be granted, do you recall any discussion about how the process required at some point evaluation of a presidential preference, or a policy preference of the president?
I'll simply observe that in the final decision document, I don't believe that there is any reference to a policy preference as a legal justification for the decision made.
Fair enough. I appreciate it.
The information we have obtained through the investigation in this committee raises serious questions regarding the account of events provided to this committee, including statements by Administrator Johnson. This committee will pursue this matter further with all the resources at its disposal. Along with Senator Whitehouse, who has taken the lead on this, I will participate in a full committee hearing in the Judiciary Committee convened by Chairman Leahy on the extraordinary use of privilege and obstruction of oversight in the Congress on global warming issues. This Thursday, we will convene, as I said, a business meeting to consider a subpoena for the endangerment finding Mr. Burnett spoke of today. The White House has not agreed to provide this critical EPA document, clearly subjected to oversight of this committee. Our committee rules do require that we have Republican participation in the meeting, and we are so hopeful that they will be here, because it isn't a question of, how we view global warming. It's a question of information, frankly, that has been developed by professionals at the EPA. We're paying the salaries of those people, the taxpayers are, and the people have a right to see what good, caring people like Mr. Burnett have put on paper, have put in an email to lay out a strategy as to, first of all, are we endangered? They said yes. How? They explain it. And very important, I note to Mr. Burnett and others who serve so courageously over at EPA, and Mr. Burnett had to take his stand by leaving, but there are many others there. They want us to do something. And in this document, we will learn what we can do under the Clean Air Act. And as Mr. Burnett said, you can use it responsibly, you could use it not such a responsible way. I am very anxious to see that document. I need to see the document to do my job. My colleagues need to see the document to do their job. So all I want to say to all of you here today who came to testify, that we really so appreciate your valuable time. And, you know, we're going to get to the truth. And the most important thing is when we get to the truth, truth is power, and we're going to start acting in a responsible way to address a critical issue that is coming at us very hard and very fast. And if we owe nothing else to our kids and grandkids, it's to take action. And you're going to help us do that. So I thank you very much. We stand adjourned.